So, we'll be discussing today a right of the of an individual. Okay, so there are rights, of course, but these rights are not absolute. So every person must, in the exercise of that right and in the performance of his duties, act with justice, give everyone his due, and observe honesty and good faith. You may have rights, but that right, if it is exercised with prejudice or done in bad faith, then you may also be held liable. Take note, it is a right, but that right, if done without the procedure I'm going to discuss today, without the element that I'm going to discuss, the person exercising that right may be held liable. So take note, it is a right, it is your right, but you may be held liable. Now, what do you mean by right? It is a discretionary power, meaning you have the right to exercise it or not. Okay? To exact from other individuals or person the observance of a certain behavior. So the word itself is just a discretionary. You may exercise that right or you may not exercise that right. Okay? Now, there are elements of the abuse of rights or a time when a person may be held liable in exercising that right. It is called an abuse of right. What are the elements? One is there is a legal right. Okay? There is a legal right or duty, okay, for a person to perform that right. And then the second is that in the exercise of that right, it is done in bad faith. And you know what bad faith is. Okay, it is like what? Insidious. You know that it is your right, but you do not exercise it for the meantime. You let the person suffers. Okay? So that later on you will incur, you will be paid with damages. That is done in bad faith. Okay? You let the person, let us say, occupy your property, believing later on that you can claim and you're going to eject him later on as soon as he finishes constructing his house. So that is done in bad faith. You cannot easily eject him right there and then giving him only 5 days. Okay? So, although it is your right to eject in the property you own, but it is done in bad faith. Okay? So as much as possible, this is what we call as the doctrine of self-help. Any person who would intrude your property, you have the right to repel them right there and then. It is called the doctrine of self-help. But you cannot do it after, you cannot exercise that right after several days. Otherwise, that is done in bad faith and person you may be held liable in the exercise of that right because it's now an abuse of right. The third element is that, okay, the sole intent of prejudicing or injuring another. In that example, it's clearly to injure another. Imagine he is now spending money just to build a house and then you eject him right after constructing the house. Now, we go to another principle. We call it as the principle of unjust enrichment. Unjust enrichment. What does it mean? If you receive something without any legal ground, you have the right to return it. Okay? Example, in your GCash, a certain amount was deposited. Okay? Erroneously, it was credited to you. You don't have any ground to possess it because nobody deposited it in your own account. But you were able to acquire that amount. Okay? You enrich yourself at the expense of another. What is your duty? To return it. Okay? To him. To return the same. Because it is unjust enrichment. Similarly, there are principles of law. If you found something which is owned by another, and you know that he is the owner, you have to return him. Otherwise, it's called theft already. Okay? um, the principle of finders keepers doesn't apply. The principle of finders keepers only applies when you don't know the real owner. But if you know that somebody owns it, okay, you possess it, not by accident or not by uh, a mere fortune. You possess it because somebody mistakenly deposited it or mistakenly lost his property. You have the right to return it to the owner. Otherwise, that is called theft. Okay? It is not finders keepers. It is not finders keepers. You know what finders keepers? Okay? That does not apply here. If there is a real owner, somebody lost it, you have to return it. If you don't know the owner, give it to the mayor. The mayor will, under the law, is the person in authority to return it, okay, to the real owner. Now, how does the principle? What are the requisites of that principle of unjust enrichment? One is that there must be an enrichment on the part of the defendant. Okay, you enrich yourself. You receive the amount without the real owner. There must be no just, okay, or legal ground of enrichment. And then the last is that the enrichment is at the expense of the other, at the expense of the plaintiff. He lost it. It was mistakenly deposited in your account. Okay, so that is unjust enrichment. We go to another principle, the principle of liability without fault. What do you mean by liability without fault? You are innocent. You don't know the consequence, and yet you will be held liable. Okay? Even with an act or event causing damage to another property was not due to his fault or negligence. Okay? If the damage was not due to his fault, or it is not him who causes the damage, or he is not negligent, but still there is liability. Okay? Example. What is an example of this principle? A carabao, for example, because of typhoon, it reached to another property, causing damage to another property. Let's say it's owned by B. B saved the carabao, but his property was damaged. So what is the liability of A? Can he be held liable? Okay, the answer is what? Yes, he can be held liable because he caused damage to the property of B. Okay? Although he is not at fault because it's an accident, but still, if it causes damage to another, he is still held liable. Okay, these are basic principles. Okay, do not be arrogant in saying that it's not my fault. As long as it causes damage to another, you have to pay the owner. It is called liability without fault. Liability without fault. You are not negligent, but because of an accident, okay, you will be held liable. Okay, so again, the meaning is an act or event causing damage to another's property was not due. Okay, was not due to his fault or negligence. It is not his fault, but he is still held liable. Okay, so I think that's very understandable. Okay, so do not insist, because most of the cases in barangay, some insist that it is not their fault. But even if it's not their fault, they can still be held liable. It is called liability without fault. Now, another source of obligation. Another source of obligation is the acts contrary to law. Acts contrary to law, you may be held still liable. Every person who, contrary to law, willfully or negligently causes damage to another shall indemnify the latter for the same. So, what does it mean? Person who acts contrary to law, it's illegal supposedly, okay? Willfully and negligently may be held liable. So, well, it's basic, no, that any acts which are contrary to law, you may be held liable. So, in that case, there's no need of explaining it because any crime committed which are contrary to law is presumed there is always liability. Now, a principle also in criminal law which states that in every crime or in every criminal liability, there is always civil liability. Okay? What does it mean? Let us say crimes committed like murder, it doesn't only mean that you will be in prison. There's a corresponding damages that you have to pay to the victim. Okay? Like homicide, you ran over a child, you have to pay 50,000, which is the worth of the life of the person, if dead. If alive, you have to pay him all the losses, that expenses that he will incur as soon as he is alive. Okay? Until his death. That is why some of the drivers would make it sure that the victim will be dead. Now, another acts will be contrary to morals. Contrary to morals. What do you mean by contrary to morals? Okay? So, there are acts which, although not a criminal act, but if it is a violation of morals, then the person may be held liable. Example of these acts which are contrary to morals, a promise to marry. Okay, it's not a criminal act, right? Like, I promise to marry you on this particular date, okay, or 1 year from now. But if the promise would let the other party, the woman, for example, prepares the wedding, like she already invited the guests from other country or from other province, they are already there, but all of a sudden the groom changed his mind. Okay? Although it is not a criminal act, but that is contrary to morals. Can that groom be held, future groom be held liable? Yes. Okay? Yes. It's punishable. Okay? So,